Thinking, Fast and Slow. Book by Daniel Kahneman. Detailed summary. Chapter 1, The Characters of the Story. Chapter 1 of Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman is titled The Characters of the Story. In this chapter, Kahneman sets the stage for the rest of the book by introducing two characters, System 1 and System 2. System 1 refers to the intuitive, automatic, and fast mode of thinking that operates without conscious effort. It is responsible for generating quick judgments and intuitions, and it plays a significant role in our daily decision-making process. System 2, on the other hand, refers to the analytical, deliberate, and slow mode of thinking that requires conscious effort. It is responsible for performing complex calculations and analyzing data in a logical and rational manner. Kahneman explains that both systems interact to influence our behavior and decision-making, and that our reliance on System 1 thinking can sometimes lead to biases and errors in judgment. The main idea of this chapter is to introduce the reader to the two systems of thinking that Kahneman will explore in the rest of the book. By understanding the characteristics of System 1 and System 2, readers can begin to recognize when each system is being used and how it may be impacting their decision-making processes. This chapter lays the foundation for the rest of the book and sets the stage for a deeper exploration of the ways in which we think, reason, and make decisions. Chapter 2, Attention and Effort. Chapter 2 of Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman is titled Attention and Effort. In this chapter, Kahneman explores the relationship between attention and cognitive effort and how they influence our decision-making processes. Kahneman explains that attention is a limited resource that can be easily overwhelmed by too much information. He introduces the concept of cognitive load, which refers to the amount of mental effort required to process information. When cognitive load is high, we are more likely to rely on automatic, intuitive thinking, System 1, rather than deliberate, analytical thinking, System 2. Kahneman also explores the concept of selective attention, which is the ability to focus on one particular task or piece of information while ignoring others. He notes that selective attention can be influenced by factors such as interest, motivation, and emotional arousal. The main idea of this chapter is to demonstrate the relationship between attention and cognitive effort and how they can impact our decision-making processes. By understanding the limits of attention and the effects of cognitive load, we can become more aware of when we are relying on automatic thinking and when we need to engage in more deliberate, analytical thinking. This understanding can help us make better decisions in situations where we may be prone to cognitive biases or errors. Chapter 3, The Lazy Controller. Chapter 3 of Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman is titled The Lazy Controller. In this chapter, Kahneman discusses the idea that our System 1 thinking is not only automatic but also lazy. Kahneman explains that the brain is designed to conserve energy, and as a result, it tends to rely on mental shortcuts and heuristics to make quick decisions without using too much cognitive effort. This reliance on mental shortcuts can sometimes lead to errors and biases in our thinking. Kahneman also introduces the concept of cognitive ease, which is the degree to which our cognitive system is comfortable with a particular task or situation. When we experience cognitive ease, we are more likely to rely on intuitive, automatic thinking, System 1, while cognitive strain can lead us to engage in more deliberate, analytical thinking, System 2. The main idea of this chapter is to illustrate that our System 1 thinking is not only automatic but also prone to being lazy. By understanding this tendency, we can become more aware of when we are relying too heavily on automatic thinking and when we need to engage in more deliberate, analytical thinking. This awareness can help us avoid errors and biases in our thinking and make better decisions. Chapter 4, The Associative Machine. Chapter 4 of Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman is titled The Associative Machine. In this chapter, Kahneman explores the concept of associative thinking and its role in decision-making. Kahneman explains that our brains are designed to make associations between different pieces of information based on similarity, contiguity, and repetition. This associative thinking allows us to quickly make connections between different ideas and concepts. However, these associations can also lead to errors and biases in our thinking. Kahneman introduces the concept of the halo effect, which is the tendency to judge a person's overall character based on a single trait or characteristic. He also discusses how the framing effect can influence our decision-making, as the way a decision is presented can significantly impact our perception of it. The main idea of this chapter is to demonstrate the power of associative thinking and its potential influence on our decision-making. By understanding the biases and errors that can result from this type of thinking, we can become more aware of our own thought processes and make more rational decisions. Chapter 5, The Law of Small Numbers. Chapter 5 of Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman is titled The Law of Small Numbers. In this chapter, Kahneman explores how our intuition about probability and statistics can be misleading, especially when dealing with small samples. Kahneman explains that our intuition is often based on the idea that larger samples are more representative and therefore more accurate. However, this intuition can be deceptive, as small samples can lead to significant deviations from the mean and therefore misleading results. Kahneman introduces the concept of regression to the mean, which is the tendency for extreme values to become less extreme over time. He also discusses the concept of the law of large numbers, which states that the average of a large number of independent observations will converge to the true probability value. The main idea of this chapter is to highlight the potential pitfalls of relying on small samples and the importance of understanding probability and statistics when making decisions. By being aware of our biases and relying on data from larger samples, we can make more informed decisions and avoid being misled by our intuition. Chapter 6, Frames and Reality. Chapter 6 of Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman is titled Frames and Reality. In this chapter, Kahneman explores the concept of framing and how it can shape our perceptions and decisions. Kahneman defines framing as the way that a situation is presented, which can significantly impact our perception of it. He explains how our brains rely on mental shortcuts and heuristics to make decisions quickly, and how these shortcuts can be influenced by the way information is presented to us. Kahneman provides several examples of framing, including the difference between gains and losses, and how the way a question is posed can significantly impact our answer. He also discusses how our perceptions of risk can be influenced by the way information is presented, such as the use of percentages or frequencies. The main idea of this chapter is to demonstrate how framing can significantly impact our decisions, and how we can become more aware of these influences. By recognizing how information is framed and taking a step back to consider the underlying data and probabilities, we can make more informed decisions and avoid being swayed by our initial perceptions. Chapter 7, Tom W.'s Specialty. Chapter 7 of Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman is titled Tom W.'s Specialty. In this chapter, Kahneman discusses the idea of expertise and the factors that contribute to the development of expertise in a particular domain. Kahneman introduces the story of Tom W., a fire captain who has developed exceptional skills in predicting the behavior of wildfires. Tom W.'s ability to make accurate predictions is not based on formal education or extensive training, but rather on years of experience and exposure to a wide variety of wildfires. Kahneman explains that expertise is often based on the development of mental shortcuts, or heuristics, that allow individuals to quickly make decisions in their area of expertise. These mental shortcuts are often based on pattern recognition, which is developed over time through exposure to a wide variety of examples. However, Kahneman cautions that expertise can also lead to biases and overconfidence. Experts may become too reliant on their mental shortcuts and fail to consider all available information, leading to flawed decision-making. The main idea of this chapter is to explore the factors that contribute to the development of expertise and the potential drawbacks of relying too heavily on expertise. By understanding the nature of expertise and its limitations, individuals can become more effective decision-makers in their respective domains. Chapter 8, How Judgments Happen. Chapter 8 of Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman is titled How Judgments Happen. In this chapter, Kahneman delves into the process of making judgments and the various factors that influence the accuracy of those judgments. Kahneman begins by discussing the distinction between judgments of frequency and judgments of probability. Judgments of frequency involve estimating the number of times a particular event has occurred in the past, while judgments of probability involve estimating the likelihood of a future event occurring. Kahneman explains that our judgments are influenced by a variety of factors, including our prior beliefs, the availability of information, and the way that information is presented to us. For example, we may rely too heavily on recent experiences or vivid anecdotes when making judgments, leading us to overestimate the likelihood of certain events occurring. Kahneman also explores the concept of anchoring, which occurs when our judgments are influenced by an initial piece of information that we are presented with, even if that information is irrelevant to the decision at hand. He provides several examples of how anchoring can influence judgments, including in negotiations and pricing. The main idea of this chapter is to explore the complex nature of judgments and the various factors that influence them. By understanding these factors and being aware of the potential biases that can influence our judgments, we can become more effective decision makers and make more accurate judgments in our daily lives. Chapter 9, Answering an Easier Question. Chapter 9 of Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman is titled Answering an Easier Question. In this chapter, Kahneman discusses how people often substitute a difficult question with an easier one that they can answer, resulting in inaccurate or incomplete judgments. Kahneman introduces the concept of heuristics, which are mental shortcuts that we use to simplify complex tasks or decisions. One such heuristic is the availability heuristic, which involves making judgments based on how easily information comes to mind. This can lead to biases, as people may rely on readily available but incomplete or inaccurate information when making decisions. Kahneman also discusses the use of substitution, which occurs when people answer a difficult question by substituting an easier question that they can answer. For example, people may try to estimate the probability of a future event by thinking about how similar events have occurred in the past, rather than considering all relevant factors. The chapter includes several examples of how people use substitution and other heuristics in decision-making, including in financial investments and medical diagnoses. Kahneman also explores how people can overcome these biases by considering multiple factors and seeking out more information to make informed decisions. Overall, the main idea of this chapter is to highlight the limitations of using mental shortcuts in decision-making and the importance of considering all relevant factors when making judgments. By being aware of the biases that can arise from heuristics and substitution, people can make more accurate and informed decisions. Chapter 10, The Linda Problem. Chapter 10 of Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman is titled The Linda Problem. In this chapter, Kahneman introduces the concept of conjunction fallacy and uses the Linda problem to illustrate it. The Linda problem presents participants with a description of a woman named Linda, who is described as being intelligent, outspoken, and passionate about social justice. Participants are then asked to determine which is more probable, that Linda is a bank teller or that Linda is a bank teller and a feminist. Despite the fact that being a bank teller is a broader category than being a bank teller and a feminist, many people choose the latter option, which is logically less probable. Kahneman uses the Linda problem to demonstrate how people often make errors in reasoning by failing to consider the base rate, which is the likelihood of an event occurring in a general population. Instead, people tend to rely on representativeness, which is the extent to which an event or object matches our mental image of a particular category. The chapter also discusses how people tend to give greater weight to specific information than to general information when making judgments. This can lead to overconfidence and biases in decision-making. Kahneman concludes the chapter by emphasizing the importance of using statistical information and base rates when making judgments. By being aware of the limitations of representativeness and considering all relevant information, people can make more accurate decisions. Overall, the main idea of this chapter is to highlight the ways in which people make errors in reasoning by relying too heavily on representativeness and failing to consider base rates. The Linda problem serves as a powerful example of how these biases can lead to inaccurate judgments. Chapter 11, Causes Trump Statistics. Chapter 11 of Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman is titled Causes Trump Statistics. In this chapter, Kahneman explains how people tend to rely on causal explanations rather than statistical information when making judgments. Kahneman begins by describing a study that investigated how people responded to two different types of evidence, statistical evidence and anecdotal evidence. The study found that people were much more likely to be swayed by anecdotal evidence than statistical evidence, even when the statistical evidence was more compelling. Kahneman argues that this preference for causal explanations is rooted in our evolutionary history, as it was often more important for our ancestors to quickly identify causes of events in their environment than to accurately assess probabilities. The chapter also discusses the ways in which people often use causal explanations to make sense of complex events, even when those explanations are not supported by evidence. Kahneman uses the example of the hot hand fallacy in basketball to demonstrate how people tend to believe in patterns even when they do not exist. Kahneman concludes the chapter by emphasizing the importance of relying on statistical evidence rather than anecdotal evidence or causal explanations when making judgments. By being aware of the limitations of causal reasoning, people can avoid making errors in judgment and make more accurate decisions. Overall, the main idea of this chapter is to highlight the ways in which people tend to rely on causal explanations rather than statistical evidence when making judgments. By understanding these biases, people can learn to make more accurate decisions based on sound evidence. Chapter 12, Regression to the Mean. Chapter 12 of Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman is titled Regression to the Mean. In this chapter, Kahneman explains the concept of regression to the mean and how it influences our perceptions and judgments. Regression to the mean is the statistical phenomenon where extreme events tend to be followed by less extreme events. In other words, if a particular outcome is particularly good or bad, the next outcome is likely to be closer to the average. Kahneman uses a number of examples to illustrate how regression to the mean affects our perceptions and judgments. For instance, he discusses how sports coaches often make the mistake of benching players who are performing poorly, only to see those players improve in their next game. This improvement is not necessarily due to the coach's decision, but rather to the fact that the player's performance was likely to improve naturally due to regression to the mean. Kahneman also discusses the ways in which regression to the mean can lead to erroneous conclusions about causality. For example, he describes a study where patients with high blood pressure were given a medication, and their blood pressure subsequently decreased. However, because of regression to the mean, it is possible that the blood pressure would have decreased even without the medication. This can lead to false beliefs about the efficacy of the medication. Kahneman concludes the chapter by emphasizing the importance of understanding regression to the mean when making decisions. By recognizing the role of statistical variability in our perceptions and judgments, we can avoid making erroneous conclusions about causality. Overall, the main idea of this chapter is to explain the concept of regression to the mean and how it influences our perceptions and judgments. By understanding regression to the mean, we can make more accurate decisions and avoid erroneous conclusions about causality. Chapter 13, Taming Intuitive Predictions. Chapter 13 of Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman is titled Taming Intuitive Predictions. In this chapter, Kahneman discusses how our intuition often leads us to make predictions that are inaccurate, and how we can improve our predictive abilities through deliberate effort. Kahneman begins by describing the natural tendency of our intuition to rely on stereotypes and generalizations when making predictions about the future. He argues that this tendency is often inaccurate, and can lead to erroneous judgments and decisions. To counteract this tendency, Kahneman proposes a number of strategies that can be used to improve our predictive abilities. One such strategy is to explicitly consider the evidence that supports our predictions, rather than relying solely on intuition. This can be done by systematically collecting and analyzing data, and by actively seeking out feedback from others. Another strategy is to use simple algorithms and decision rules to guide our predictions. These decision rules should be based on objective data and should be easy to follow. By using these rules consistently, we can reduce the influence of our biases and intuition. Kahneman also discusses the importance of recognizing our limitations when making predictions. He argues that we often overestimate our abilities and fail to recognize the complexity of the situations we are trying to predict. By acknowledging our limitations, we can be more open to feedback and less prone to overconfidence. Finally, Kahneman emphasizes the importance of deliberate practice in improving our predictive abilities. By actively seeking out opportunities to make predictions and receiving feedback on our performance, we can improve our skills over time. Overall, the main idea of this chapter is that our intuition often leads us to make inaccurate predictions, and that we can improve our predictive abilities through deliberate effort. By systematically collecting and analyzing data, using decision rules based on objective data, acknowledging our limitations, and engaging in deliberate practice, we can improve our ability to predict future outcomes. Chapter 14, The Illusion of Understanding. Chapter 14 of Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman is titled The Illusion of Understanding. In this chapter, Kahneman discusses how our tendency to construct coherent stories based on incomplete information can lead to an illusion of understanding that is often misleading. Kahneman begins by describing how humans have a natural tendency to seek out causal explanations for events, and how this can lead us to construct narratives that make sense but are not necessarily accurate. He calls this the illusion of understanding, which is the feeling of having a coherent and causal explanation for a phenomenon, even when the explanation is not supported by the evidence. To illustrate this phenomenon, Kahneman discusses a number of examples, such as the illusion of understanding that often accompanies financial market forecasting, as well as the tendency to overestimate the predictive power of personality tests and job interviews. Kahneman argues that the illusion of understanding is particularly dangerous in situations where decisions are made based on incomplete or ambiguous information. In such situations, our tendency to construct narratives can lead us to make decisions that are based on faulty assumptions and incomplete data. To counteract the illusion of understanding, Kahneman proposes a number of strategies. One such strategy is to actively seek out disconfirming evidence, which can help to challenge our assumptions and test the coherence of our narratives. Another strategy is to be aware of our own biases and limitations, and to actively seek out feedback from others. Overall, the main idea of this chapter is that our tendency to construct coherent stories based on incomplete information can lead to an illusion of understanding that is often misleading. By being aware of this tendency and actively seeking out disconfirming evidence, we can better evaluate the coherence of our narratives and make more informed decisions. Chapter 15, The Illusion of Validity. Chapter 15 of Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman is titled The Illusion of Validity. In this chapter, Kahneman explores how the illusion of validity, the belief that we can predict outcomes with accuracy, can lead to overconfidence and poor decision-making. Kahneman begins by describing how our brains are wired to look for patterns and make predictions, even in situations where there is little or no evidence to support our predictions. He notes that this tendency can be reinforced by a number of cognitive biases, such as confirmation bias and the halo effect, which can lead us to overestimate the accuracy of our predictions. To illustrate the illusion of validity, Kahneman presents a number of examples from a range of fields, including sports, financial forecasting, and military intelligence. In each case, he demonstrates how experts in these fields can become overconfident in their ability to make predictions, despite the fact that their predictions are often based on incomplete or inaccurate information. Kahneman argues that the illusion of validity is particularly dangerous in situations where decisions are made based on predictions that are highly uncertain, such as in the stock market or in political forecasting. He notes that in such situations, overconfidence can lead to poor decision-making and even financial ruin. To counteract the illusion of validity, Kahneman suggests that we need to be more skeptical of our own predictions and more open to the possibility that we might be wrong. He also suggests that we need to rely more on objective data and less on subjective judgments when making decisions. Overall, the main idea of this chapter is that the illusion of validity, the belief that we can predict outcomes with accuracy, can lead to overconfidence and poor decision-making. By being more skeptical of our own predictions and relying more on objective data, we can avoid the pitfalls of the illusion of validity and make better decisions. Chapter 16, Intuitions versus Formulas. In Chapter 16 of Thinking, Fast and Slow titled Intuitions versus Formulas, author Daniel Kahneman explores the differences between relying on intuition and using formal algorithms to make decisions. Kahneman begins the chapter by discussing how professionals, such as doctors and financial analysts, often rely on their intuition to make judgments rather than using statistical formulas. While intuition can be helpful in some situations, it is often unreliable and can lead to errors. To demonstrate this point, Kahneman presents a case study involving judges who were asked to set bail for defendants. The judge's decisions were found to be highly influenced by irrelevant factors such as the time of day, indicating the limitations of intuition. Next, Kahneman discusses the benefits of using algorithms and statistical models in decision-making. He cites several studies that show that simple formulas outperform human intuition in a variety of domains, such as predicting college grades and medical outcomes. He notes that algorithms are not perfect, but they are less susceptible to cognitive biases than human intuition. Kahneman also highlights the importance of transparency when using algorithms. He argues that people are more likely to trust and accept decisions made by formulas when they understand how the formulas work. In contrast, when the algorithms are opaque or complex, people are more likely to be skeptical and resist using them. In conclusion, Kahneman argues that while intuition can be useful in some situations, it is often unreliable and can lead to errors. Formal algorithms and statistical models, on the other hand, are generally more reliable and less susceptible to cognitive biases. However, it is important to use transparent and easily understandable algorithms to gain the trust and acceptance of users. Chapter 17, The Limits of Intuition. In Chapter 17 of Thinking, Fast and Slow titled The Limits of Intuition, author Daniel Kahneman explores the boundaries and limitations of intuition in decision-making. Kahneman begins the chapter by discussing how intuition can be beneficial in certain situations, such as recognizing patterns and making quick judgments. However, he notes that intuition is not infallible and can often lead to errors and biases in decision-making. To illustrate this point, he presents a number of examples and studies that demonstrate how intuition can be misleading and unreliable. One example that Kahneman cites is the gambler's fallacy, which is the belief that past events can influence the probability of future outcomes. He notes that this fallacy can lead to poor decision-making in gambling, financial investments, and other areas where probability is a factor. Kahneman also discusses the planning fallacy, which is the tendency to underestimate the time and resources needed to complete a task. He notes that this fallacy can lead to poor planning and decision-making in a variety of contexts, from personal projects to large-scale business ventures. Additionally, Kahneman highlights the impact of emotion on intuition and decision-making. He notes that emotions can cloud judgment and lead to impulsive or irrational decisions, and that people often overestimate the importance of emotional events in their lives. In conclusion, Kahneman argues that while intuition can be beneficial in some situations, it is important to recognize its limitations and potential for error. He emphasizes the importance of being aware of cognitive biases and using systematic and analytical thinking to supplement intuition in decision-making. Chapter 18, The Endowment Effect. Chapter 18 of Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman discusses the endowment effect, which is a cognitive bias that describes how people tend to value an item they possess more than the same item they do not possess. This effect is often seen in economic situations, such as when someone is unwilling to sell an item for less than they originally paid for it, even if the market value of the item has decreased. Kahneman describes a study he conducted with his colleague, Jack Netsch, in which participants were randomly assigned to receive a mug or a chocolate bar, and were then given the option to trade their item for the other. The researchers found that participants were more likely to want to trade their item if they had originally received the less desirable item, example a chocolate bar instead of a mug, but were generally unwilling to trade if they had received the more desirable item. The endowment effect can be explained by loss aversion, which is the tendency for people to feel the pain of a loss more than the pleasure of a gain. When people possess something, they feel that they have something to lose, which makes them more attached to it and less likely to want to give it up. The endowment effect can also be influenced by other factors, such as ownership, familiarity, and emotional attachment. Kahneman also discusses how the endowment effect can have real-world implications in areas such as negotiation, pricing, and decision-making. For example, sellers may use the endowment effect to their advantage by setting high prices for items they are selling, knowing that buyers may be more attached to the item and therefore willing to pay more for it. On the other hand, buyers may use the endowment effect to their advantage by making a low initial offer for an item they want to purchase, knowing that the seller may be reluctant to give it up for less than they believe it is worth. Overall, the endowment effect is a powerful cognitive bias that can have significant implications in many areas of life, and being aware of its influence can help individuals make more rational and effective decisions. Chapter 19, Bad Events. Chapter 19 of Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman is titled Bad Events. In this chapter, the author explores how people think and react to negative events in their lives, such as losing money or experiencing an illness. He explains that people have a tendency to overestimate the impact of bad events and to underestimate their own resilience in dealing with them. Kahneman describes how people often make poor decisions when they are in a negative emotional state, such as selling stocks during a market downturn or making impulsive purchases after a breakup. He notes that people also tend to remember bad events more vividly than good ones, which can lead to a distorted view of the past. The author introduces the concept of the peak end rule, which states that people's memories of an experience are determined by the most intense moment and the end of the experience, rather than by the overall experience. He also discusses the phenomenon of duration neglect, where the length of a negative experience has little impact on people's memories of it. Kahneman notes that people often view negative events as being caused by someone or something external, rather than as the result of random chance. This can lead to feelings of anger and a desire for revenge, which can be counterproductive. The author concludes the chapter by suggesting that people should try to maintain a realistic perspective on bad events, recognizing that they are a natural part of life and that they are not always caused by external factors. He also suggests that people should take steps to mitigate the impact of bad events by building resilience and maintaining a positive outlook. Chapter 20, The Two Selves. Chapter 20 of Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman explores the concept of the two selves, the experiencing self and the remembering self, and how they shape our perceptions and memories of our lives. The experiencing self is the part of us that lives in the present moment, constantly processing information from our senses and making judgments about our experiences. The remembering self, on the other hand, is the part of us that reflects on our past experiences and creates a narrative of our lives. Kahneman argues that our remembering self has a disproportionate influence on our decision-making, as we tend to make choices based on the memories we have of past experiences rather than the actual experiences themselves. This can lead to inaccurate predictions of future experiences, as we may base our expectations on flawed memories rather than the reality of the situation. Kahneman also explores the idea of duration neglect, which is the tendency to disregard the length of an experience when evaluating its overall quality. This can result in a situation where a short but intense experience can be remembered as more significant than a longer but less intense experience. The chapter concludes with a discussion of the implications of the two selves for our well-being, suggesting that we can improve our overall satisfaction with life by focusing on maximizing positive experiences in the moment rather than trying to create a cohesive narrative of our past experiences. Chapter 21, Experience versus Memory. Chapter 21 of Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman is titled Experience versus Memory. The chapter discusses the difference between our experiencing selves and our remembering selves and how this affects our perception of happiness. Kahneman argues that our experiencing selves are focused on the present moment, while our remembering selves focus on the stories we tell about our experiences. These stories are often incomplete and subject to biases and distortions. Kahneman also introduces the concept of the peak end rule, which suggests that our overall evaluation of an experience is largely determined by the peak moment of intensity and the ending of the experience. This can lead to situations where we may prefer a shorter but more intense experience over a longer and more enjoyable one. Kahneman then discusses the implications of these ideas for the measurement of happiness and well-being, arguing that it is important to distinguish between moment-to-moment experiences and overall life satisfaction. He notes that interventions aimed at improving happiness may need to focus on improving the stories we tell about our experiences, rather than simply trying to increase the frequency of positive experiences. Overall, the chapter highlights the complex relationship between experience and memory and the challenges involved in accurately assessing and improving subjective well-being. Chapter 22, Thinking About Life. Chapter 22 of Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman discusses how we think about our own lives, how we create narratives about our experiences, and how these narratives can be misleading. Kahneman explains that our memories are constructed from a combination of our actual experiences and our interpretation of those experiences. When we think back on our lives, we tend to focus on the most memorable and emotional events, and we often construct a narrative that emphasizes certain themes or patterns. However, this narrative can be misleading because it is based on our subjective interpretation of events rather than objective reality. Kahneman suggests that it is important to recognize the limitations of our own memories and to be aware of the biases that can distort our perception of our own lives. Kahneman also discusses the concept of the experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self is the part of us that is in the present moment, experiencing life as it happens. The remembering self, on the other hand, is the part of us that remembers our experiences and constructs a narrative about our lives. Kahneman argues that we should pay more attention to the experiencing self and focus on enjoying our present experiences, rather than just focusing on creating a positive narrative about our lives. He suggests that we can achieve greater happiness by focusing on the present moment and by engaging in activities that we enjoy, rather than just trying to create a positive narrative about our lives. Overall, Chapter 22 emphasizes the importance of being aware of the limitations of our own memories and being mindful of the present moment, rather than just focusing on creating a positive narrative about our lives. Conclusion: Two Selves Revisited. In the conclusion of Thinking, Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman revisits the concept of the two selves, the experiencing self and the remembering self, that he introduced in Chapter 20. He notes that people tend to prioritize their remembering selves when making decisions, even though the experiencing self is the one that actually undergoes the events being considered. This can lead to decisions that do not optimize for well-being in the moment. Kahneman also emphasizes the importance of being aware of the biases and limitations of one's thinking, and using this awareness to make better decisions. He suggests various strategies for doing this, such as framing problems differently, seeking out diverse perspectives, and being mindful of the limitations of intuition. Finally, Kahneman acknowledges that his own work has been influential in the field of psychology and beyond, and that it has led to a greater appreciation of the complexity of human thought and decision-making. He concludes by noting that while there is still much to be learned, he hopes that his work will continue to inspire others to explore the fascinating and sometimes perplexing workings of the human mind.